It was my own son who framed me and sent me to prison for a crime I never committed. They thought this old man was broken, powerless, and forgotten. But they never imagined what was about to happen. With just one phone call, everything would change. Before I tell you how it all began, drop a comment and let me know where are you watching this from. I want to know who's listening to an old man's story of betrayal and revenge. The cell walls were damp and smelled like old concrete, dried sweat, and lost hope. For me, Theodore Griffin, those walls had eventually turned into a makeshift calendar. Using the rough, chipped tip of my thumbnail, I carved another small vertical line near the leg of my iron cot. That made 729 marks. Tomorrow would be day 730, the day I would finally walk out of Dallas County Jail. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the stale Texas air that tasted like rust and bitter regret. The heat turned the cell into a literal oven, even after the sun went down. I sat cross-legged on the thin mattress that had served as my bed for 2 long years. Before this nightmare, I slept in a king-sized bed in my Highland Park mansion. Before this, I was Theodore Griffin, the founder of Sterling Industries with a net worth of $70 million. Now, I was nothing more than inmate A47239. The memories hit me like a flood, bringing back the courthouse and Judge Morrison's icy stare. I remembered my own son, Logan Griffin, standing on the witness stand in a perfectly pressed suit with a look of fake sorrow on his face. He told the court he loved his father but claimed he couldn't justify my actions. He lied and told them I pushed Delilah down the stairs while she was pregnant, killing my unborn grandchild. Then Delilah took the stand in a wheelchair, clutching her stomach and crying crocodile tears for the jury. She sobbed about how I screamed at her and pushed her until she felt her baby dying. Every single word was a total lie. I had actually gone to Logan's office that day to confront him about $1.5 million missing from the company accounts. I never even touched Delilah, but she threw herself down those stairs to frame me. The security cameras had conveniently stopped working during those exact minutes, leaving only footage of me looking furious at the top of the landing. When the gavel finally struck, my entire world collapsed. I watched Logan embrace Delilah, and in that moment, I didn't see guilt. I saw cold, hard calculation. It was the look of someone who had just wiped out the only obstacle to a massive inheritance. I tried to fight back, but Logan moved way too fast by filing an emergency petition to freeze my accounts and claiming I was mentally unstable. Without any access to my money, I couldn't hire the high-powered attorneys who actually could have saved me. I was stuck with an overworked public defender who barely even glanced at my case before telling me to plead guilty. I refused to do it. I went to trial, and I lost everything. "Theodore, you daydreaming again?" A raspy voice suddenly interrupted. It was Carl Bennett, my cellmate and a man in his 60s serving time for fraud. He was my only real companion in this hellhole. "Just counting, Carl," I replied quietly. Carl folded his uniform and told me I should be praising the Lord since I'd be walking free tomorrow. He said I was too calm, like I was just going to the grocery store instead of leaving hell. I let out a faint smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. I whispered to him that the real hell wasn't in this cell. The real hell was waiting for me out there. Carl raised an eyebrow but kept his mouth shut. I stood up and walked over to the cracked mirror above the sink to look at myself. The man staring back was a stranger with gray-streaked hair, a hardened face, and darker eyes. I dropped 20 pounds, not because of the bad prison food, but because of the rage burning inside me like a furnace. I thought about Elizabeth, my wife of 30 years, who passed away 3 years ago before she could see what our son had turned into. I whispered the names Logan and Delilah like they were curses. Tomorrow they would be waiting outside with reporters, pretending to be a happy family and playing their roles for the cameras. But I had learned how to be patient in this cell. Patience is a powerful weapon, and revenge is definitely a dish best served cold. I'd been keeping mine on ice for 2 years. The cell door would open in just a few hours, and when it did, hell was coming out with me. It was visitation hours, and the sound of expensive shoes started echoing down the hallway. Logan was coming to see me again. Officer Martinez announced the visitors and mentioned that my son said it was urgent. I closed my book, knowing this was just one last desperate attempt. The visitation room was split by thick plexiglass. Through the window, I saw Logan in a $3,000 suit looking exhausted, which felt good. Beside him sat Delilah and Chanel, who both looked a bit thinner, which felt even better. Logan grabbed the phone, and I waited a beat before lifting mine. "Dad, please," Logan's voice cracked as he begged me to sign the trust fund transfer for $2 million because the company was failing an audit. "Hello to you too, son." I cut him off with a cold stare. Delilah leaned in with tears already starting to well up in her eyes. She told me they had taken care of everything while I was away and kept Sterling Industries running, saying it was the least I could do for them. My laugh was loud and bitter. I asked them if sitting in a cage for a crime I didn't commit while they lived in my house was enough. "My house," Logan corrected me sharply, claiming he was the CEO now and the assets belonged to him. I told him nothing was his until I was dead. Just then, I saw a figure in the doorway behind Logan. It was my daughter Grace, 29 years old, wearing a black Armani suit with her hair pulled back tight. Her face was a blank mask as she stepped toward us. Logan glanced back and told Grace to tell me how hard this has been on them. Grace met my eyes through the glass. Her eyes, which used to be warm like Elizabeth's, were now flat and completely empty. "Father." Grace's voice was flat and almost clinical. She told me I should just sign the papers because it was for the best. She explained that the company was falling apart without access to the trust fund and that I really should just cooperate. I felt something snap deep inside of me. Even Grace, my own daughter, was standing there siding with Logan. "Even you, Grace?" I whispered. She just looked away and stayed silent. Logan leaned forward with a desperate look in his eyes, telling me to listen. He explained that the bank required biometric verification, fingerprints and facial recognition, which is why they needed me at the bank tomorrow. He said it was just one signature for $2 million. I coldly asked him why he didn't just forge it. Logan's face turned red as he snapped back that it was a federal crime and the bank had security systems in place. I gave him a hollow smile and told him it was funny how he suddenly cared about breaking the law. Delilah's fake tears disappeared instantly, replaced by pure anger. She called me a stubborn fool and accused me of destroying everything just out of spite. "Careful, Delilah," I said, my voice turning to ice. I told her I had absolutely nothing left to lose and asked if she could say the same. Logan slammed his hand on the table and yelled that I'd be walking out tomorrow with nothing. No money, no family, and no power. He claimed they controlled everything now. I leaned in, locking eyes with my son, and softly told him we would see about that. I promised him that tomorrow, I would show him what having nothing really looks like. I stood up and hung up the phone. Through the glass, I could see Logan's mouth moving as he shouted, and Delilah was pointing at me, but I just turned my back on them. As I walked toward Officer Martinez, I heard Grace's quiet voice through the glass. She didn't say she'd see me tomorrow, she just said goodbye. When I turned to leave, Grace was standing perfectly still with a face like a mask of cold indifference. There wasn't a single crack in her act. The morning sunlight spilled through the iron gates of the Dallas County Jail like liquid gold. I stepped into the light, blinking against the brightness after spending 730 days in the dim gloom of fluorescent bulbs. The September heat hit me instantly, bringing that thick, humid Dallas air that smelled like a mix of gasoline, freedom, and new beginnings. A crowd had already gathered outside the gates with reporters holding cameras and microphones. Standing center stage like actors waiting for their cue were Logan and Delilah. My son was wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost $3,000, his face twisted into a look of practiced remorse. Beside him, Delilah clutched a bouquet of white roses and wore a cream-colored dress that was clearly just a prop for the cameras. "Dad." Logan's voice boomed across the parking lot, loud enough for every microphone to catch it. He welcomed me back and shouted that they were there for me because we were family. I didn't slow down for a second. I kept walking forward in my wrinkled white shirt and faded jeans, which hung loose on me after 2 years of prison food. These were the same clothes I'd been wearing the day I was arrested, and they were the only things I owned now. Logan stepped toward me, holding out the roses, and begged me to come home so we could talk and work everything out. I walked right past him, not around him, but past him, as if he were just a piece of broken sidewalk furniture. Logan's voice got sharper as he reached out and grabbed my arm. He told me not to make a scene and ordered me to get into the car right now. I stopped slowly and turned my head to look at his hand gripping my arm before meeting his eyes. I knew the cameras were catching every single detail. "Let go of me," I said quietly, making sure every word hit home. I told him if he didn't let go, I would scream that he was assaulting me right in front of all these reporters. Logan's hand dropped as if he'd touched a hot stove. I started walking again. Behind me, I heard Delilah's voice rise as her fake persona started to crack. She started yelling that I was completely insane and that 2 years in jail had destroyed my mind. A deep rumble from a powerful engine cut her off mid-sentence. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided into the parking lot like a panther, its chrome gleaming in the sun and demanding everyone's attention. The license plate simply read, "Brooks." Every camera immediately swung toward the car. The driver's door opened, and a young man in his early 30s stepped out. He looked athletic and wore an expensive charcoal three-piece suit, with dark hair and intelligent eyes behind rimless glasses. He moved with the kind of quiet confidence you can't fake. It was Maxwell Brooks, Harvard Law, top of his class, and the attorney known for winning the most impossible cases. Logan had tried to hire him last year for a corporate lawsuit, but Brooks had turned him down without giving a reason. Maxwell walked straight to me, completely ignoring the reporters and Logan's look of total shock. He didn't care about anything except his client. "Mr. Griffin," Maxwell said, his voice clear and respectful. He told me that everything was ready. I gave his hand a single, firm shake. Maxwell opened the back door with a professional bow. I paused for a moment to look back at Logan and Delilah. They were frozen in place, the roses wilting in Delilah's hands and their mouths hanging open as their carefully planned media stunt fell apart. I didn't smile or gloat. I just looked at them so they could see that I was a completely different man than the one who went into that prison. Then I slid into the Rolls-Royce. The leather seats felt like an embrace, and the interior smelled like luxury, polished wood, and power. The door closed with a solid thunk that sounded like a bank vault locking shut. Outside, total chaos broke out. Reporters swarmed Logan, asking who picked up his father and if the reconciliation was canceled. They wanted to know where I got the money. Logan's face went from confusion to pale shock, then to a burning red. He stammered, wondering how I knew Maxwell Brooks. Delilah grabbed Logan's arm, her composure completely shattered. She hissed at him that he had said Brooks refused to work with them and that he had promised her I had nothing left. Through the dark-tinted windows, I watched the look of total realization finally hit Logan's face. He'd completely messed up his math and underestimated me, but the game wasn't over yet, it was only just beginning. Maxwell slid into the driver's seat and hit the start button, making the engine purr to life. "Where to, sir?" Maxwell asked, catching my eye in the rear-view mirror. I leaned back and closed my eyes, taking my first real breath of freedom in 2 years. Outside, I could hear Logan shouting and see reporters chasing the car, and I couldn't help but smile a smile as cold as winter. I told him to take me to the sanctuary because I needed to wash the memory of their touch off me. Then, we would start the war. The Ritz-Carlton penthouse took up the entire 42nd floor, with massive floor-to-ceiling windows that showed Dallas stretching all the way to the horizon. I stood there for a long time, just breathing in the air of a free man. Eventually, I walked into the bathroom, which was covered in marble and gold fixtures with a shower that had 6 different heads. I turned the water up until it was scalding hot, stripped off my prison rags, and stepped inside. The water felt like a baptism, and I scrubbed myself with hotel soap that smelled like cedar and bergamot, which was nothing like that cheap prison carbolic. I scrubbed until my skin was raw, trying to wash away 2 years of that place and 2 years of betrayal. The tears came then, hot, silent, and heavy, as I leaned against the marble and let them fall. They didn't come from weakness. They came from pure rage and grief for the man who had actually trusted his own son. That man was officially dead. When I finally came out wearing a plush robe, Maxwell Brooks was waiting in the living area, but he wasn't alone. An older woman was sitting in one of the leather chairs with her spine perfectly straight and a sharp look in her eyes. She was past 60 with short silver hair and a professional charcoal pantsuit. Maxwell stood up and introduced her as Beatrice Walsh, the best defense attorney in Texas. She told me she had finished her own sentence before I was even locked up, explaining that she had been a scapegoat for corporate corruption. She'd spent 5 years in prison because she refused to betray her client, and she had only been out for 6 months. Maxwell had been her student, and he told her all about my situation. I asked if she wanted to help me, and she corrected me by saying she wanted to destroy corrupt bastards, and my son definitely fit the bill. Maxwell pointed to a pile of documents on the coffee table and said we had to move fast while Logan was still off balance. I sat down and told them to show me what they had. Maxwell laid out the first document, which was a power of attorney. He explained that since Logan had declared me mentally incompetent, we were going to revoke it immediately. My signature would reactivate my status as a 70% shareholder. I signed it without a second thought. Next was an emergency forensic audit, which would freeze every single company account until it was finished, meaning Logan wouldn't be able to move a cent without board approval. I asked how long it would take, and they told me at least 30 days, longer if they found irregularities, which they definitely would. I told them to do it. Beatrice then leaned forward and handed me a manila envelope with no name on it, just a single letter. G. My hand froze because I recognized that handwriting instantly. Inside was a flash drive and a note on plain paper that said it was 2 years of work and everything I needed. It told me to trust Maxwell because he was a solid ally. Maxwell plugged in the drive, and his laptop screen filled up with spreadsheets, bank records, emails, and evidence of money laundering. It showed bribes to Judge Morrison and the technician Logan had paid to mess with the security footage. I asked quietly who sent this. Maxwell said it was anonymous but clearly came from someone with deep access to Sterling Industries, someone Logan trusted completely. I stared at that letter G, and my chest felt tight as I wondered if Grace could really be the one. She had been so cold and distant yesterday, but maybe there was more to it. I pushed the thought aside and told them to execute the freeze. I wanted Logan cut off from every single account, corporate, personal, everything. I wanted him to feel exactly what it's like to have nothing. Maxwell's fingers flew across the keys as he confirmed the bank would have the court order within the hour. By tomorrow morning, Logan's credit cards would be declined and he'd have zero access to his money. I went back to the window and looked down at the city. Dallas was pulsing below me. It was my city, my company, and my empire. Logan thought he could just steal it, but he had seriously miscalculated. Beatrice handed me one more thing. A recent photo of Logan and Delilah at Sterling Steakhouse, laughing and toasting with champagne. On the back, in that same handwriting, it said to let them enjoy their last supper. I let out a cold smile. Maxwell asked when we should go public, and I agreed that tomorrow was the time for a press conference. I would announce that I was taking back control, and the media would eat up the story of a wrongfully convicted man reclaiming his empire. Across town, Logan's phone started ringing in his executive office. When he saw it was First National Bank of Texas, he frowned and picked up. A woman named Susan Jones from Account Services told him they were seeing major irregularities with his accounts and ordered him to come to the branch immediately. Logan's blood ran cold because he knew this news would absolutely destroy him. Meanwhile, Sterling Steakhouse was glowing with old money elegance, crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, and soft jazz. It was the kind of place where the Dallas elite closed deals over $30 steaks. Logan sat at the center table where everyone could see him, making a real power statement. Delilah was dressed in burgundy Valentino, and across from them sat Richard and Patricia Sterling, potential investors who owned Sterling Construction. My son was desperate for their $15 million investment, promising a huge return within 18 months. Logan gestured with his wine glass, talking about how downtown Dallas was booming and this was the perfect moment to invest. Richard noted that I had built quite an empire, but Logan smoothly corrected him, saying he was the one expanding it and bringing it into the modern era. Patricia asked carefully how I was doing since my release today. Logan's smile didn't even flicker as he lied, saying the 2 years had taken a toll on me and that I was confused, but they were handling everything and making sure I got the care I needed. Delilah just smiled and placed her hand on his. It's honestly heartbreaking, but at the end of the day, we're family, Logan said with a sigh. Just then, the waiter arrived at the table with an $850 bill. Logan didn't even look at it as he casually pulled out his corporate black card and handed it over, telling the man to keep the change. The waiter swiped it, but a sharp beep echoed through the quiet air. Declined. Logan frowned as the waiter tried again, but the same result followed. His stomach dropped into his shoes as he muttered about the machine probably glitching and told him to try it once more. After the third failed swipe, the waiter apologized and explained that the machine was telling him to contact the card issuer. Patricia and Richard exchanged worried glances while Logan let out a loud, nervous laugh. He told Delilah to use her card instead, but since it was a supplementary card on the same account, it was declined immediately. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the table. Logan stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor, excusing himself to call the finance department. He paced toward the entrance with his phone pressed to his ear, calling the CFO, Gerald Thompson. He demanded to know why the cards weren't working, but Gerald sounded like he was in a total state of panic. He told Logan that he'd been trying to reach him because every single company account was frozen by an SEC order at 5 o'clock for an emergency forensic audit. Logan felt like his world was tilting on its axis as he asked who could have possibly authorized that. "Your father did," Gerald replied quietly, explaining that Theodore had reactivated his status as the majority shareholder and the board had immediately sided with him because they still trusted the founder. Logan screamed that he was the CEO, but Gerald reminded him that his appointment was only based on a power of attorney that had now been revoked. Legally, Theodore had never actually stopped being the chairman. Gerald added that the $2 million withdrawal Logan tried to make that morning had been canceled and flagged as suspicious, and now every account was locked tight until the audit cleared. He then told Logan to turn on the TV. Logan spun around toward the flat screen in the bar just as CNBC showed me standing at a podium. The Sterling Industries logo was behind me, and I was wearing an expensive suit, looking healthy, powerful, and absolutely furious. The caption on the screen announced my return to the company. I, Theodore Griffin, as the rightful owner and chairman, am announcing a complete management restructuring effective immediately. My voice rang out with perfect clarity. I told the world that while I was wrongfully imprisoned, massive financial crimes had occurred, funds were diverted, and trust was violated. I promised that legal action would be taken against every single person responsible. My eyes seemed to burn through the camera lens directly into Logan's soul as I stated that the company would be clean from top to bottom. The screen cut back to the reporters as I walked away, leaving Logan standing there frozen in shock. Every eye in the steakhouse was fixed on him now. Patricia showed her husband something on her phone, likely the news alert, while the waiter hovered awkwardly with the unpaid bill. Delilah appeared at Logan's side, hissing at him that people were staring and demanding to know what was happening. Logan couldn't even find his voice. He caught his own reflection in the brass fixtures and saw a man who had just realized he had absolutely nothing left. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that told him to enjoy his last supper. It was signed with the letter G. It wasn't just a declined credit card anymore, it was total checkmate. The next morning, Logan woke up to his phone vibrating violently on the nightstand. He had 47 missed calls and 63 texts before 7 in the morning. He unlocked it to find a text from his assistant begging him to call immediately and another from a board member asking what the hell was going on. A third message included a link that Logan clicked, which opened Twitter to show the hashtag #JusticeForTheodore, trending at #1 with 2 million mentions. The top tweet was from an anonymous account that had leaked an image of a medical record from Mercy General Hospital. Logan's hands shook as he read the diagnosis for Delilah from September 23. It stated she had suffered a miscarriage due to illegal diet pills and had undergone an emergency procedure that night. Logan realized with horror that the date was 2 days before she allegedly fell down the stairs at the office. The comments were exploding with people calling her a liar and pointing out that the baby was already dead before the incident. They were calling me innocent and accusing Delilah of destroying a family for money. Logan scrolled through Instagram, TikTok, and Reddit as the entire internet turned against them in a matter of hours. He threw his phone against the wall in a fit of rage, which woke Delilah up. She asked what was wrong, and Logan told her to get up as he shoved his iPad in her face. He demanded she explain why the records showed she miscarried 2 days before the fall. Delilah turned white as a sheet and claimed the records were fakes created by my father, but Logan told her to stop lying. He grabbed his phone and called Dr. Jones at the hospital, putting him on speaker. When Logan asked if the record was authentic, there was a long pause before the doctor confirmed it was. He said it had been stolen by a fired nurse but was a genuine record. Logan hung up and stared at Delilah while she started crying, real tears this time. She tried to explain, but Logan slowly repeated that she had lost the baby because of illegal diet pills and then faked the whole fall. Delilah screamed that she was scared because Logan had told her he'd leave her if she couldn't give him an heir. Logan grabbed her by the shoulders and shouted that she had sent his father to prison for 2 years for a baby that didn't even exist anymore. "I saw an opportunity," she cried, admitting she panicked when she saw how angry I was about the missing money and thought the lie would set them free. Logan released her as if she were made of poison and stumbled back. He whispered that he had destroyed his own father and testified against him for nothing. Delilah's mask finally cracked, revealing the ugliness underneath as she told him not to pretend this was about justice. She spat that he wanted the company just as much as she did, and she had simply given him the excuse he needed. Logan just stared at her, seeing her for who she truly was for the very first time. She wasn't the beautiful wife or the grieving mother he thought he knew. She was a cold, calculating stranger who had been playing him from the very start. Delilah stood her ground with her chin lifted high, looking at him with nothing but contempt. She told him he destroyed his father because he was greedy and warned him not to blame her for his own weakness. Those words hung in the air like poison as the sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside. Logan walked over to the window and saw 3 news vans parked right outside the gates with reporters already setting up their cameras. His phone buzzed with another message from an unknown number. It simply said that the truth always surfaces eventually. The clock tower in the distance chimed 3 times, the sound echoing through the manicured streets of Highland Park like a funeral bell. At that exact moment, the massive wrought iron gates of the Griffin mansion, adorned with a silver G that I had commissioned 30 years ago, slowly groaned open. I sat in the back of Maxwell Brooks' black Bentley, my fingers tracing the fine grain of the leather seats, feeling the cool rush of the air conditioning against my skin. For 2 years, I had dreamed of this specific scent, the smell of expensive leather and success, while I was rotting in a cell that smelled of mildew and despair. Flanking our vehicle were 2 white and blue Dallas police cruisers, their lights off but their presence radiating a heavy, undeniable authority. Behind us, a massive yellow moving truck sat idling, its diesel engine letting out a low, rhythmic rumble that shook the very pavement of the driveway. I stepped out of the car, my polished shoes hitting the cobblestones with a decisive snap, and looked up at the house I had built with my own 2 hands. Logan appeared at the front door almost instantly, looking like a ghost of the man I used to know. He was a wreck, standing barefoot on the marble threshold in a wrinkled dress shirt that was missing 2 buttons, his hair matted and oily. His eyes were bloodshot from what I assumed was a sleepless night spent watching the news of my return, and his hands were visibly shaking. He stepped onto the porch, shouting at the top of his lungs, demanding to know what the hell was going on and why there were police on his lawn. I didn't say a word. I simply stood there with my arms crossed, watching him unravel in real time. The court official beside me stepped forward, adjusting his glasses and pulling a heavy stack of legal documents from a leather briefcase. He began to read in a dry, monotonous voice that made the life-altering words sound like a grocery list. He explained that property deed 4729 was registered under my sole ownership as a premarital asset, protected by a trust that even Logan's high-priced corporate vultures couldn't touch. An immediate eviction had been granted by the Superior Court, effective the second I set foot on the property. Logan's mouth hung open as the words finally began to sink in, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He stammered, his voice cracking as he pointed toward the house, claiming that he was my son and that this was their home. My voice cut through his protests like a shard of ice, cold and sharp enough to draw blood. I looked him dead in the eye and told him it wasn't his home anymore. It was my house, and it always had been. I told him he was nothing more than a guest who had overstayed his welcome, a tenant who had stopped paying rent and started stealing the silverware. I watched the realization hit him that the power dynamic had completely shifted, and for the first time in 2 years, he was the one looking through the glass. Before he could respond, Delilah rushed out of the house in a silk bathrobe that cost more than a year of prison commissary. She was screaming, her voice shrill and desperate, telling the officers that I couldn't do this to them and that they had rights. I turned my gaze to her, feeling a wave of pure revulsion wash over me. I told her plainly that she was no lady, despite the expensive clothes she wore, but rather a parasite who had simply attached herself to the wrong host. I warned her that her time feeding off the Griffin name was officially over. I turned back to the officers and gave them a sharp nod, instructing them to let the couple remove only their personal clothing and basic toiletries. I made it very clear that anything bought with Sterling Industries funds or my personal accounts during the last 2 years was to stay exactly where it was. Delilah let out a piercing scream when she realized the officers were actually going into her walk-in closet to enforce the order. She cried out about her designer dresses, her limited edition bags, and her jewelry collection, claiming they were her property. I cut her off mid-sentence, my voice booming across the lawn so the neighbors could hear. I told her that every thread on her back and every diamond on her finger was paid for with stolen money and forged signatures. I told her that if she wanted luxury, she should have married a man who didn't have to frame his father to afford a lifestyle he didn't earn. She stood there trembling, the silk of her robe fluttering in the Texas heat, looking small and pathetic for the first time in her life. Just as the movers began to carry the first empty crates toward the front door, a black BMW pulled up to the curb. Grace Griffin stepped out of the vehicle, looking impeccably professional in a navy pantsuit that radiated power and poise. She wore dark sunglasses that hid her eyes, making her face look like a blank, unreadable mask. Logan's face lit up with a sudden, desperate spark of hope, and he practically tripped over his own feet as he ran toward the driveway. He begged her to intervene, calling her name and telling her to explain to me how insane this whole situation was. Grace didn't even break her stride. She walked right past him without a single glance, her heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement like a countdown clock. She approached me and stood by my side, her presence a silent declaration of where her loyalty truly lay. In a measured, clinical voice, she asked if we could perhaps handle this more privately, reminding me that despite everything, he was still my son. My jaw tightened as I felt the old anger flare up, and I told her to stay out of it, making it clear that the time for private discussions had ended the moment I was handcuffed in a courtroom. Grace lowered her head for a moment, her voice dropping to a whisper as she warned me that a public eviction of this scale would destroy him. She said that family was supposed to be a sanctuary, even when it was broken. I looked at her, and then at the shivering wreck of a man standing on the porch, and I told her that Logan hadn't been destroyed by me. He had destroyed himself the second he chose a lie over the man who gave him life. Grace turned toward Logan then, and for a fleeting second, I saw her expression soften into a mask of deep, genuine regret. She told him she was sorry, but that she had tried everything she could to prevent this outcome. Logan reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric of her suit as he begged her to call me off. He looked like a drowning man reaching for a life raft that was already moving away. Grace pulled her arm free with a gentle but firm motion, a final severing of the tie between them. She told him that he had made his choices long ago when he chose Delilah's schemes over my guidance and chose a forged legacy over the truth. She told him she couldn't help a man who would willingly betray his own father for a larger share of a company he didn't understand. Without another word, she turned her back on him and walked toward her car, leaving him standing in the middle of the driveway, completely alone. The next 30 minutes were a blur of organized chaos and public humiliation. The officers escorted Logan and Delilah back inside to gather their things, watching them like hawks to ensure they didn't try to smuggle out any of the silver or hidden jewelry. Neighbors began to emerge from their own mansions, standing on their manicured lawns with their smartphones raised, recording every second of the fall of the Griffin heirs. Logan and Delilah were eventually led back out through the front door, looking smaller than I ever thought possible. They stood outside the gates with only 3 mismatched suitcases and 2 nylon duffel bags, the meager sum of everything they could actually prove they had bought with their own legitimate money before the embezzlement began. I stood by the Bentley and watched as the heavy iron gates began to swing shut. The electronic hum of the motor was the only sound in the afternoon air until the gates met in the center with a loud, metallic clank of finality. Logan was staring through the bars, his hands gripping the iron just as mine had gripped the bars of my cell for 730 days. He looked at the house, then at me, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a goodbye. I simply turned my back on him and looked toward the horizon. By nightfall, I knew that every news station in Dallas would be running the footage of the Highland Park eviction, and the world would finally know that Theodore Griffin had returned to reclaim what was his. The empire was being rebuilt, but for Logan and Delilah, the gates were closed forever, and the darkness was just beginning. The neon sign for the Sunset Motel hummed with a sick, flickering buzz, casting a harsh pink light through the grime-streaked window of room 2. Inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on, a suffocating cocktail of stale cigarette smoke, industrial-strength bleach, and the unmistakable stench of mildew and defeat. 3 days ago, Logan and Delilah had been the unofficial royalty of Highland Park, dining on Wagyu beef and sipping vintage Bordeaux. Now, they were holed up in a roadside box that felt more like a tomb than a shelter. The air conditioner was a prehistoric beast bolted into the wall, rattling so violently it vibrated the floorboards, yet it only managed to spit out a lukewarm breeze that did nothing to combat the oppressive Texas humidity. Logan sat on the edge of the sagging queen mattress, the springs groaning under his weight, staring at the stained floral bedspread that probably hadn't been washed since the late 90s. He was meticulously counting a small pile of crumpled bills for the fourth time in an hour, hoping through some miracle of mathematics that the total would change. It didn't. He had exactly $180 left to his name, a sum that wouldn't have even covered the tip at their favorite steakhouse a week ago. The bathroom door creaked open, and Delilah stepped out, looking like a ghost of her former self. Gone were the hours of professional styling and the high-end products that usually kept her hair in a perfect, golden halo. Instead, her hair hung limp and greasy against her neck, darkened by the sweat of a room that refused to cool down. She walked over to the cracked mirror above the vanity, her face pale and sallow in the unforgiving fluorescent light. She began to complain, her voice a sharp, grating whine that had become the soundtrack to their new life. She lamented the lack of shower pressure, the way the water smelled like sulfur, and the fact that she had just seen a cockroach the size of a thumb scuttle behind the rotting baseboards. For Delilah, the physical decay of their surroundings was a personal insult, a reality her ego simply couldn't process. She looked at her reflection and saw a stranger, a woman stripped of the luxury that had acted as her armor for so long. Logan didn't even look up from his meager pile of cash as he told her she was free to leave whenever she liked. The comment was flat, devoid of the passion or protection he used to offer her, which only served to fuel her growing resentment. Delilah snapped back at him with a venomous glare, asking him what money she was supposed to use to go anywhere. She reminded him that her supplementary accounts were just as frozen as his, and she was just as much a beggar in this room as he was. She paced the threadbare carpet, her heels catching on the loose fibers, and called him an idiot for the way he had mismanaged the transition of power. She blamed his arrogance for the fact that my return had caught them so completely off guard. Logan's face flushed a deep, angry crimson, his jaw tightening until the muscles jumped in his cheek. He stood up, towering over her in the cramped space, and reminded her that he wasn't the one who had fabricated a tragedy to win over a jury. He told her not to dare blame him when she was the one who had looked into those cameras and lied about a baby that was already gone. The mention of the miscarriage hit the room like a physical blow, stripping away the last of their pretenses. Delilah yanked her arm free when Logan tried to emphasize his point, let out a piercing scream, and confessed the truth with a terrifying lack of remorse. She shouted that she only did it because he was too weak to take the company on his own merit. She told him that she saw him wavering, saw the guilt in his eyes every time he looked at his father, and she decided to give him a reason to stay the course. She claimed she had thrown herself down those stairs to save him from his own cowardice, to give them a life of absolute power that he was too timid to claim. After the scream faded, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence that was broken only by the rhythmic, taunting sound of the dripping faucet in the sink. Logan sank back onto the bed, his head falling into his hands as the full weight of his reality finally crushed him. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just lost his money. He had lost his home, his father, his sister, and the very core of his dignity. The silence became a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room until Logan felt he might actually pass out from the pressure of his own mistakes. Desperate for a lifeline, any lifeline, he reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the one name that hadn't yet been scrubbed from his memory. He called Grace. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each tone feeling like a needle in his ear. On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. Grace's voice was neutral, almost clinical, as she asked him what he wanted from her. Logan's voice broke instantly, a jagged sob catching in his throat as he begged her for help. He called her Gracie, a nickname from their childhood that felt hollow and pathetic in the context of the motel room. He asked her to talk to me, to tell me he was sorry, and to explain that he was willing to do anything to make amends. He promised he would work for minimum wage in the mailroom, live in a tiny studio apartment, and give up every luxury he had ever known just to be back in the family's good graces. Grace didn't interrupt him. She let him spill his desperation into the receiver until he ran out of words. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but held the weight of a mountain. She told him that he had made his choice long ago when he valued a bank balance over the man who had raised them. She reminded him that he had sat in a courtroom and watched our father be led away in chains for a crime he knew was a fabrication. Logan tried to launch into a final defense, claiming he truly didn't know about Delilah's miscarriage until the records were leaked, but Grace cut him off with a cold, sharp truth. She told him that deep down, in the parts of his soul he tried to ignore, he always knew I was innocent. She said he didn't care about the truth because the lie was too convenient, too profitable, and too easy. When Logan let out a final, whimpering plea for her to help him because she was his sister, the silence on the other end lasted for an eternity. Then, Grace spoke one last time, correcting him with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid closing. She told him she wasn't his sister anymore. The line went dead with a hollow click, leaving Logan staring at a dark screen that reflected his own hollow eyes. Across the room, Delilah had retreated to the corner, sitting on a rickety wooden chair with her knees pulled up to her chest. Her expensive mascara had finally given way, running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks that made her look like a broken porcelain doll. They didn't speak to each other, and they didn't offer a single word of comfort. There was no love left in that room, only the cold, hard realization that they were trapped in a prison of their own making. They existed in separate spheres of misery, two strangers who had sold their souls for an empire that had vanished like smoke in the wind. Outside the motel, a police siren began to wail in the distance, the sound growing louder as it sped down the highway before slowly fading into the night. To both of them, it didn't sound like a call for help or a sign of protection. It sounded like a funeral bell, marking the end of everything they had ever been. The dripping faucet continued its steady count. Drip, 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 measuring out the seconds of a life that was now defined by what was missing. Logan looked at the $180 on the bedspread and realized it was the price of his soul. He had traded a father's love and a sister's trust for a stack of paper that wouldn't even keep them in this room for another week. Delilah remained silent in her corner, her eyes fixed on a hole in the carpet, perhaps finally realizing that the man she had manipulated into power was now nothing more than a ghost. As the neon sign outside buzzed and flickered, casting rhythmic flashes of pink across the peeling wallpaper, they sat in the wreckage of their lives, waiting for a tomorrow that offered nothing but more of the same. The Sunset Motel was the end of the road, the place where the Griffin legacy went to die, leaving behind nothing but the smell of mildew and the echo of a sister's goodbye. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Caldwell Plaza was an architectural marvel of glass, steel, and ruthless ambition, but today it felt more like a mausoleum. The silence was heavy, a suffocating pressure that seemed to weigh down the 8 board members who sat around the massive slab of Carrara marble that served as the conference table. Outside, the Dallas skyline was bathed in a deceptive golden morning light, but inside, the atmosphere was cold enough to frost the windows. I sat at the head of the table, a position I had held for 3 decades before my son's betrayal, feeling the familiar cool touch of the stone against my palms. Behind me, Maxwell Brooks stood like a silent sentinel, his fingers hovering over the keys of his laptop, ready to dismantle a legacy of lies. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, precisely 1 week since I had evicted Logan from my home, and the final stage of his downfall was about to begin. I didn't offer a greeting or a preamble. The time for pleasantries had died 2 years ago in a prison transport bus. I simply reached out and pressed a single button on the integrated console in front of me, and the massive high-definition screen on the far wall hummed to life. The first image was a simple line graph, a jagged red streak that looked like an open wound cutting across a field of white. I watched the eyes of the board members, men and women I had once called friends, as they stared at the plummeting data points. I began to speak, my voice steady and resonant, lacking any trace of the tremor that prison life tries to beat into a man. I explained that during Logan's brief and disastrous tenure as CEO, the company's net profits had cratered by 40%, a nosedive that would have triggered a shareholder revolt in any other firm. Even more damning was the debt, which had ballooned by a staggering 200% as he took out predatory loans to cover the holes he was digging. Maxwell clicked to the next slide, and the screen filled with a complex web of financial transactions, a digital trail of breadcrumbs that led straight into the dark. We showed the board a series of suspicious bank transfers, amounts ranging from $50,000 to $500,000, all flowing into a network of shell companies that existed only on paper. The money wasn't being reinvested in research or development. It was simply disappearing through the cracks of the corporate foundation. I paused on one specific slide, a transfer for $1.5 million to an entity titled Lux Consulting LLC. The listed purpose for the payment was interior design services and aesthetic branding, a description so absurd it almost felt like an insult to our intelligence. I scanned the faces of the board members, leaning forward until my reflection was visible in the polished marble. I asked them, with a voice dripping in dry sarcasm, who among them would authorize $1.5 million for curtains and throw pillows while the company was bleeding out. The room remained silent for a heartbeat before Richard Garrett, a founding board member whose hair had turned silver alongside mine, spoke up. He leaned over the table, his eyes fixed on the name of the consulting firm, and asked the question that was hanging in the air like a guillotine. Who actually owned Lux Consulting? Maxwell didn't hesitate. He brought up the incorporation papers on the screen, highlighting the signature at the bottom. He answered clearly and firmly, stating that the owner was none other than Delilah Griffin. The document was dated just 3 weeks after I had been sent to prison, a celebratory gift from a husband who had just stolen his father's crown. The murmurs began then, a low, buzzing sound of collective realization and growing disgust as the board members finally saw the extent to which they had been played. The doors at the back of the room burst open with a violent crash, the sound of heavy wood hitting the stoppers echoing like a gunshot. Logan stumbled into the room, looking like a ghost that had been dragged through the mud. He had clearly shoved past the security detail at the reception desk, outrunning them by a mere second as they appeared behind him, looking flustered and apologetic. Logan was a complete wreck. He was wearing the same wrinkled jeans and messy shirt he'd been wearing since the eviction, his face covered in a thick, uneven layer of stubble. His hair was a chaotic mess, and his eyes darted wildly from face to face, searching for a crumb of the authority he used to wield. "I'm still the legal CEO," he shouted, his voice cracking and high-pitched. He pointed a trembling finger at the board, claiming that this meeting was illegal and that any vote taken without his presence was invalid. I didn't turn around. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my face or acknowledging his presence as a peer. I kept my eyes fixed on Richard Garrett and simply told the room that Logan was nothing more than a common thief who had mistaken a temporary seat for a permanent throne. Logan scrambled to the edge of the table, trying to argue that the $1.5 million was part of a business diversification strategy aimed at expanding the brand's lifestyle presence. He talked faster and faster, his words tripping over each other as he tried to justify the embezzlement. Maxwell cut him off mid-sentence, his voice sharp and clinical as he called it exactly what it was. He reminded Logan that diverted corporate funds for personal use was a federal crime, one made significantly more grave because of his fiduciary duty as an officer of the company. I stood up slowly, the movement commanding the room's attention and forcing Logan to stop his frantic rambling. I announced to the board that as the holder of 70% of the voting shares that had been reactivated the moment my incapacity was legally vacated, I was moving to dismiss Logan Griffin from all positions within Sterling Industries, effective immediately and with a dishonorable discharge. Logan's face went a translucent shade of white, and he staggered back as if I had physically struck him. He stammered that I couldn't do it, citing the corporate bylaws that required a 51% majority to override a sitting CEO. He tried to claim that without a formal vote from the other shareholders, I was powerless to move against him alone. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and told him he was right about the bylaws. I acknowledged that while my 70% was more than enough to crush him into the dirt, I wasn't interested in a mere majority. I wanted the dismissal to be a unanimous statement of the company's values. I looked toward the side door, the one leading to the executive private elevator, and told Maxwell it was time to invite our final board member inside. Logan's eyes filled with a fresh wave of confusion, his brow furrowing as he tried to figure out who was left. He thought he had accounted for every player on the board, but he had forgotten about the 30% that had been held in a private, untouchable trust. The side door opened with a quiet, mechanical whir, and Grace Griffin stepped into the room. She was the picture of corporate elegance in a charcoal gray suit, her expression unreadable behind a mask of professional calm. Logan's knees almost gave out as he saw her, a final spark of hope lighting up his eyes. He cried out her name, begging her to tell the board that the plan was still in place, that they were still a team. He truly believed, in his delusional desperation, that his sister was there to save him from our father's wrath. He reached out for her, but Grace didn't even acknowledge his hand. She walked to the empty seat at the far end of the table, placed her leather portfolio down with a soft click, and sat. I watched Logan's face as the last of his hope died and was replaced by a terror so profound it made him go limp. He looked at Grace, then at me, then at the screen showing the evidence of his crimes. He was trapped in a room with the two people he had underestimated most, surrounded by the wreckage of an empire he had tried to steal. The silence returned to the boardroom, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of an execution. It was the silence of a new beginning, a clean slate that was about to be signed in his own blood. I sat back down, looked at my daughter, and asked if she was ready to cast the final vote that would end her brother's career and start his journey to a prison cell. Logan let out a soft, whimpering sound, the sound of a man who finally realized he was already dead. The doors opened again, and Grace Griffin walked in wearing a sharp white suit with her hair pulled into a tight, professional bun. Her heels clicked with measured precision as she crossed the room. Logan's face shifted from anger to confusion, and then finally to a look of pure relief. He thanked God and begged Grace to tell everyone how insane the situation was. Grace walked right past him as if he were just a piece of furniture and took her seat at the table. Logan's smile died instantly as I introduced her as the holder of the other 30% of Sterling Industries shares, the one she had inherited from Elizabeth's private trust. Logan staggered back, shocked because he thought those shares had been dissolved. Grace told him coldly that he was wrong. She explained that Mom had left everything to the two of us with specific instructions that Logan would only inherit anything after proving he could lead with ethics. She pulled out a thick file and revealed that for 2 years, she had been documenting every single thing he did. She had records of every shady transaction, every fake invoice, and every lie he'd told. Logan grabbed a chair just to stay upright, realizing that Grace had been helping me all along. He couldn't believe she had played the part so well, even when she visited me in prison and acted like she had turned her back on me. Grace's voice cracked for a moment as she admitted she had to pretend to side with him. She had stood in that visitation room and called our father unstable, attended Logan's dinners, and listened to his plans just to collect evidence. Her voice hardened as she told him she had saved every email and document he'd ever sent her. Logan staggered back, accusing his own sister of betraying him. Grace slammed her hand on the table and screamed that he was the one who sent an innocent man to prison. She asked him how he could live in our father's house and destroy his reputation all out of pure greed. Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice stayed strong as she told him he could have had everything eventually, but he was too impatient to wait. She laid out the proof of the bribes to Judge Morrison, the payments to the security tech, and the money laundering. Logan looked around the room and saw only disgust on the faces of the board members. He turned to Grace one last time, reminding her he was her brother, but she told him that brother was gone. She composed herself and officially voted to dismiss him and pursue criminal prosecution. I nodded and called for the vote, and 8 hands went up in unison. It was unanimous. I quietly called for security, and Samuel Rodriguez stepped forward to take Logan away. Logan whispered a plea to Grace, but she simply turned her chair toward the window and refused to look at him. As Samuel's hand closed on his arm, Logan pulled free and screamed her name one last time, but she didn't move. She just sat there facing the skyline. Logan's final view of the room was me sitting at the table like a reclaimed king, the board members discussing our next steps, and Grace with her shoulders trembling but her posture never breaking. The door closed and the lock clicked shut. Logan Griffin had officially lost the last person in the world who might have saved him. 3 months after the boardroom showdown, the George L. Allen Courts building was packed with reporters and curious onlookers. I sat in the front row with my gray suit perfectly pressed and my spine straight. Beside me, Grace wore a simple black dress and rested her hand lightly on mine. On the defendant's bench, Logan slumped over in an orange jumpsuit with his wrists cuffed. Delilah sat 2 seats away with a hollow, empty look on her face, and the two of them didn't even glance at each other anymore. When Judge Maren Kellerman entered, the room went silent. She spoke with a voice that cut through the air, finding Logan guilty of embezzlement, wire fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit perjury. She sentenced him to 15 years in a state penitentiary without any chance of early parole. Logan's head dropped in defeat. Then, the judge turned to Delilah. She acknowledged that Delilah had cooperated with the prosecution, but said her role in framing an innocent man was too big to overlook. She sentenced Delilah to 12 years in state prison. I didn't move a muscle as the bailiffs led them both away. Logan turned back one last time to find my eyes, but my gaze was like ice. Outside the courthouse, under the massive Texas sky, I stopped on the stone steps. Grace turned to me with wet eyes and whispered that it was finally over. I pulled her into my arms and finally let go, weeping with deep, shaking sobs that had been building up for 2 years. I choked out a thank you, telling her she had given up everything by pretending to hate me for so long. Grace held me even tighter and told me she simply couldn't let him win. I told her with a raw voice that she was the only family I had left and the only one who stayed loyal. She pulled back and wiped her tears, telling me I was her only family too, and that was the only thing that mattered now. Behind us, Maxwell Brooks and Beatrice Walsh stood quietly, watching as we finally began to leave the nightmare behind. This moment was sacred, a final closing of a dark chapter. 1 year later, I found myself sitting across from Logan in the cold visitation room of the Texas State Penitentiary. Logan's face had grown gaunt and hollow, and his prison uniform looked faded and worn out from a year of hard time. "Dad," Logan said softly, his voice barely a whisper. He told me he knew he didn't deserve anything, but I didn't let him finish as I slid a thick manila envelope across the table toward him. Logan's hands were trembling visibly as he pulled out the legal document inside. His eyes scanned the bold print at the top which read, "Transfer of Ownership, Sterling Industries." He read the names out loud. Grace Eleanor Griffin, 100% shareholder and chief executive officer. "You're giving her everything," Logan's voice finally cracked as the reality set in. I looked at him flatly and told him that I already had. 6 months ago, the entire empire became hers. Logan looked up at me with a desperate, pleading expression and asked what that meant for him. I leaned forward, making sure he heard every word clearly. I told him that he was no longer my son legally, emotionally, or financially. He had made his choice when he picked greed over family and picked Delilah over me. Logan begged me not to say that, but I stood up anyway, signaling that the meeting was over. I told him he would serve every bit of his 15 years, and when he finally walked out, he would have absolutely nothing. No name, no legacy, and no father. I turned toward the exit, but Logan's broken voice called out one last time, telling me he was sorry. I paused for a moment with my back to him, and for a second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then, without turning around, I walked out. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind me with a sound of finality. Outside, the Texas sun was blazing over the flat, endless horizon. I walked toward the black sedan where Grace was waiting, leaning against the car with her arms crossed and a small, knowing smile on her face. She asked gently how it went, and I simply told her it was done. She nodded and said, "Good." I looked at my daughter, my partner and my only true family, and asked if she was ready to run an empire. Grace just grinned and reminded me that she'd already been running the show for 6 months. I let out a real laugh, the first one I'd felt in years. As we pulled away from the prison, I caught one last glimpse in the side mirror. The gray walls grew smaller and smaller until they finally disappeared completely. The past was buried, and the future belonged to us. This is my story, a true account of betrayal, sacrifice, and the high price of loyalty. I'm Theodore Griffin, and I'm sharing this on Grandpa's Stories because I want everyone to learn the lesson I had to learn the hard way. Family isn't just about the blood in your veins. It's about who stands right beside you when the world is burning down. Don't be like my son, Logan, and don't let greed blind you to the things that actually matter. Never betray the people who built the very foundation you stand on. I lost my son forever that day, not because of a prison sentence, but because of his own selfish choices. In exchange, I gained a daughter who proved that real love requires incredible sacrifice. God gave me Grace for a reason, to remind me that loyalty and integrity still exist in this broken world. She spent 2 years pretending to abandon me just to save me, and that is the kind of person worth fighting for. So, here's my advice. Choose your family wisely, choose character over convenience, and always choose loyalty over greed. If you loved my story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you have watched it from and what you would have done if you were in my place. This inspires us to share more such stories with you.